It's James Carnahan, and I'm with the Northern Virginia Astronomical Club, and was going to talk about things you can or hopefully can see or see from your home. Um, let's get started. Next slide, please. So I was going to talk about planets, double stars, star clusters, nebulae, well, a nebula anyway, galaxies, and back up one. I had a little key. So for objects you need a telescope, this is the graphic. That's with the slide. Binocular objects, which you can see a lot of stuff with. And then naked eye objects. All right, next slide. Planets. Well, you have to look really quick or get up early to see most of the planets right now. Next slide. This is looking due west. Right around, I think now. Who has the time?
It is 8:30.
Okay. This is in about 17 minutes if the Blue Ridge isn't in the way. Mercury is right above the horizon. So it's an evening object, and it's about the only planet you'll be able to see if you have unobscured horizons. Next slide, please. If you have a pair of binoculars and you can see the horizon, turns out the planet Mercury is by the Pleiades star cluster, which makes a nice little image to see in a pair of binoculars. The Pleiades star cluster is about 444 light years away and is 8 light years across. I forgot how far Mercury was, but we'll talk about that anyway. Sorry. Next slide. Most of the planets, you had to get up early. This is about 5:30 tomorrow morning, and look due east right before the sun rises. You see this blob of light here? That's because the planets Jupiter and Venus are nearly in the same field of view, almost touching in the sky, because they are lined up in the sky for months. Going further out, you'll be able to see Mars, a little red dot, and another bright dot further is Saturn. This does show Neptune, but you're not going to be able to see that with your naked eye tomorrow morning. But this is about 5:30. So most of the planets are morning objects right now. So I can't show you the rings of Saturn, which is always fun to see through a telescope. Next slide. Now, I'm going to talk about double stars, which are fun. You should need a telescope. Next slide. Can everybody see the Big Dipper? Oh, up here, upside down. If you look at the cup of the Big Dipper, and these two stars here, they point to Polaris, the North Star. And then you have the Little Dipper down here. So if we looked that way later tonight, you'll be able to see the upside down Big Dipper, and it's pointing down to Polaris. Next slide, please. Turns out, when you look at Polaris in a telescope, it has a companion or two. Well, my telescope, there's only one companion. So you see a bright star, which is Polaris, and then its companion that's not as big. Looks like a gray star. So you actually see in the telescope, it's a double star. Well, actually, it's a triple star. But we're not going to be able to see it with my telescope. So the brighter one is like 5 times the mass of the sun, and the other are a little larger than the sun. So that's interesting. Our pole star is a triple star system. Next slide, please. Turns out there's even more double stars hanging out in the northern sky. And the handle of the Big Dipper is Mizar. It's actually, if you have really young eyes, you'd be able to split Mizar with your own eyes. Next slide, please. So you would be able to split it This isn't a binoculars or a telescope. You can split Mizar and Alcor. And if you have young eyes like you do, you might be able to split the double star in the sky all by yourself. In a telescope, the two of these are actually double stars themselves. So I would split one pair just looking at it with my eyes. Well, not my eyes, maybe binoculars. And in the telescope, those two will split and be two pairs. And if you take spectroscopy of Mizar itself, it turns out those two stars that consist of Mizar have pairs themselves that they detect using spectroscopy, or which indicates how much the color shifted due to the movement of the stars going around each other. Next slide, please. Another double star hanging around the Big Dipper area is Coralie. So here we have the Big Dipper go off the handle. And there's a nice bright star there off the handle. That's Coralie, which will be interesting in a bit, as what else we can see in that area. Next slide. So here we have another double star that can be split or resolved with a telescope. All right, so that's close in. So let's see what else we can see in the sky. Next slide, please. So, spring's a great time for galaxies. But I'll be talking mainly about the ones hanging around the Big Dipper, since it's easy for us to find. Next slide. So we were just talking about this double star system here, Coralie, that's right off the handle of the Big Dipper. Well, it turns out there's a galaxy right off the handle of the Big Dipper, known as the Whirlpool Galaxy. And around here, since we have nice dark skies, you could actually make it out in a pair of binoculars. Next slide, please. So you would see a small double blur, two lobes of blur in a pair of binoculars or in a telescope. So there's a main Whirlpool Galaxy with a little satellite galaxy. And these are about 31 million light years away. So that is also by the Big Dipper. Continuing on that trend, next slide. Going back up to the Coralie, using that as a guide off the handle of the Big Dipper, there's another galaxy. So we had Whirlpool right here, and then getting a little closer to this star, you'll see the Sunflower Galaxy. Next slide. And it's another spiral galaxy that you can see a little blur in a pair of binoculars or a little spiral in a telescope, and it's about 29 million light years away. All right, some more objects. Since I started with the Big Dipper as a good point of reference to everything, there's another set of galaxies. Here, you go to the cup of the Big Dipper, and you line up these two stars. Follow a line there, about the same length between the two. You look here in the sky, and this is what you'll see. Next slide, please. A pair of galaxies. Here's an elliptical M81 and an irregular galaxy M82, sometimes called the whale of the cigar galaxy. But these are bright enough you can see, especially out here, if it clears up with a pair of binoculars, and definitely with a telescope. So those are nice galaxies to find. Next slide. And I'll point out a nebula you can find in these dark skies that we have out here, if it clears up with a telescope. Next slide. Speaking about the Big Dipper, we're having fun with the Big Dipper tonight. Right by this star here in the cup, there's a nebula right here to look for in a telescope. It's the Owl Nebula. Next slide. And it's what's called a planetary. It's a shell of an expanded star. So it's a spheral. It looks like to us a sphere that's 2,400 light years away and about a light year across. And if you have really dark skies, you can make out two voids that almost look like eyes. That's two lobes of material that were blasted away from the dying star. And that's the Owl Nebula. Next slide, please. We have a few star clusters. Well, there's all sorts of objects tonight, but I'll point out a few. Next slide, please. Now we're looking, instead of the Big Dipper, we'll be looking over in this direction. I guess toward the tennis courts, or due southwest here. You'll have a pair of stars in the Constellation of Gemini, and you'll see this backward question mark up in the sky, and that's part of Leo, the constellation Leo. Well, between those is a triangle of stars known as Cancer, the constellation Cancer. Right in the middle of Cancer is the Beehive cluster. Next slide, please. Now, if we're looking, if it's really dark and you have really good eyes, it actually looks like a dusting of stars, spherical pattern of stars. And this is the Beehive cluster known as M44. It's an ideal binocular object, and you can see it with a wide field eyepiece in a telescope. It's about 1,000 stars, about 11 light years across and 610 light years away. So that's a nice, easy object, especially in the dark sky, to see. It looks like a beehive swarm of stars. Next slide, please. Also in this triangle of stars, by the bottom, one of the bottom stars of the triangle is another star cluster known as M67, or M47, I'm sorry. Next slide, please. And it's another binocular object. It doesn't have quite as many stars as the Beehive, but it's a nice star cluster, open star cluster. In Constellation of Cancer. Next slide, please. Now, if we look due east, there'll be a polygon, or 4 stars, part of the Hercules Constellation, right above the bright star Vega that's rising. The neat thing about Hercules, it has a really neat cluster, a globular cluster that's densely packed with stars. It's right in this keystone area by this star. And this is what it looks like next.
Wow.
And it has hundreds of thousands of stars, and it's a great telescope object, and it's a great binocular object. It looks like a fuzzy ball of stars, even with the binoculars or without. And then next, and since it's spring, there's all sorts of galaxies to be had. There's a galaxy cluster that you can look at. Next slide, please. So we just got done looking at Hercules over here. This is almost due south. Remember that backwards question mark I was talking about? That's Leo the Lion constellation. And there's another bright star that this points to, and there's a couple stars here. Well, it turns out between Leo, and this is the constellation Virgo, and by this cup here, between these two stars is a cluster of galaxies. Next slide, please. So if I go work my way from this star, and this is the corner of that Leo constellation. I work my way from here. There's all sorts of little spiral and elliptical galaxies in here. And one of the neat things that's going on right now is, I think about right here, one of these galaxies has a supernova that's exploding. And so you can see a star in the galaxy that normally isn't there. I might be able to show it to you if the clouds permit. Or if it's still shining. The supernova don't last forever. It's the dying gasps of a star. So this is a huge cluster of galaxies, at least 1,500. And it's also part of the we're part of the super cluster that's part of the Virgo cluster group of galaxies. And I think that completes my presentation. I have a few references. I belong to the Northern Virginia Astronomical Club, which actually supports events like this and star parties throughout Northern Virginia at various parks. And there's all sorts of benefits. There's online meetings. There's a library. There's telescopes you can check out. It's about 1,000 members, and they have all sorts of expertise. You can learn about all sorts of things in astronomy. Stellarium.org is a free software you can download to your computer if you want to explore the sky and see some of the things I've been showing. I use the Sky Safari Astronomy application for my computer or my phones to do the presentation. IDA.org, or that dark sky website, refers to the International Dark Sky Association. Of course, you know about RLP, the Rapid League for Environmental Protection. And then I got a lot of the facts for this presentation from Wikipedia. Anyway, is there any questions that you would have? And I'm hoping it's going to get dark and clear for us so I can actually use my telescope tonight. All right.
So how far are double stars from one another, and are they stable, or do they eventually decay into, crash into one another or spin away from one another?
It varies. Some are really close, some eventually